Okay, hello there everyone, and welcome to today's District Administration web seminar. Thanks so much for joining us. It's great to have you all with us today. My name is Kurt Isley-Durley. I am the magazine's web seminar editor, and I'll be your moderator. The title of our event today, as you see here, is Leading Personalized Learning. Digital programs help meet the needs of all students, and is being brought to you through the generous support of our sponsor for today, McGraw-Hill Education. First, as people are still coming in, a bit of background about our topic for today. Personalized learning solutions are helping educators leverage digital curriculum technology to create individualized learning paths for each student based on personalized and adaptive instruction. The leading personalized learning curriculum programs are based on decades of rigorous research and applied learning science to engage students, empower educators, and improve outcomes. Today we'll be learning more about some of the capabilities and features of today's personalized learning solutions and how to best use them in your district. We're looking forward to a very interesting presentation and discussion here, plus live Q&A. So do stay tuned. We're going to get started in just a minute or two here. But before we do, just some quick housekeeping here. If you're having any trouble listening through your computer speakers, or if you prefer to listen over the phone, we will post the phone number and access code in the chat panel that you should see at the middle right margin of your screen there. You can use that to get audio access over the phone if you need it at any time. And speaking of which, that chat panel, you can also use that to send a message to our host and producer. His name is Jason York. Just choose his name from that drop-down menu and let him know if you're having any technical problems. If you have a question for our speakers here, please feel free to use the Q&A panel at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen there. Just make sure it's set to all panelists, like it says on the screen here. You can feel free to ask a question at any time as we're going here. We'll answer as many as possible when we get to the Q&A at the end. So once again, if you have a question, feel free to enter it at any time in the Q&A box, bottom right-hand corner of your screen there. Also, we will make the slide deck available for you to download, and the archived recording of our presentation here will be available. If you want to go back over it or share with any of your colleagues, anyone at your team, at your district, but I'll tell you more about that a little bit later on. So with that, on to our program here. Today we're very fortunate to have with us Jason Green. He's Executive Director of School Programs at McGraw-Hill Education. Also with us is Sean Mahoney. She is Chief Academic Officer of School Programs, also at McGraw-Hill Education. And we are delighted to have them both here with us today. Jason is going to start us off today. So with that, I will turn it over to him at this point. Jason, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to our web seminar today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kurt, for the introduction. It's very exciting to be here and discussing a topic that I know is extremely critical right now for a number of school districts as they're wading the waters in personalized learning, especially doing so through significant purchases of technology, through figuring out teacher training, to figuring out implementing major systems overhauls in some cases. And so it's exciting to be here to discuss this topic. Thank you so much. First and foremost, I would like to invite all of you here to connect with me on Twitter at Jason Todd Green and at #BLInAction. For those of you who are officially connected educators and using Twitter or other social media, I'm definitely a big believer in educators being very well networked, very well connected. And so definitely excited to have those of you who are on the line link up with me on Twitter. My goal for today's session is to really spend a couple of minutes just setting the stage for what actually is personalized learning. And within that, also sharing some of the tips, some pitfalls, some ways to really make sure that your implementations are sound, And so this first portion of the webinar is really about setting the stage. And first and foremost, as we set the stage, let's talk about building common language. Right now in education, a lot of terms are being thrown back and forth, sometimes being used synonymously, but there are some key differences in some terms that right now I think are important to expound upon. Well, the first of which is differentiation. This is where the teacher drives instruction and adjusts learning needs for groups of students, groups there being the operative word. Then we have individualization, where the teacher drives and accommodates learning needs for an individual learner. Obviously, individual right there being the operative word. And then finally, we have personalization, where the learner and the teacher collaborate to drive learning and determine the needs, plan, and learning design for the learner. Much of this work in terms comes from research by Bray and McGraw-Hill, who have really done really phenomenal work in helping to ensure that the naming conventions that we're using are actually understood by educators in a way that we can be using the same words and actually be meaning the same thing. So to dive a little bit deeper into that, personalized learning is similar to differentiation and individualization in that they each provide different learning experiences in content, process, as well as output. So a learner in the same class could be doing different content, different subject matter. They could be learning in different ways. That's, of course, the how. And they could be demonstrating that they're learning in different ways as well. Where personalized learning is actually different from differentiation and individualization is that it becomes more student-centered and increases student agency. So we're hearing more and more this notion of choice and voice. And we're also hearing more and more this kind of idea of the learner becoming a co-planner and co-creator of their learning. And this can look several different ways. This can be planning and designing conferences where the student is genuinely involved with the teacher. This could mean ongoing formative assessment, where the student becomes an authentic owner of their data. And it could also mean student learning portfolios, where the student is involved in real-time and ongoing reflections of their learning, self-assessment, and demonstrations of their learning. There's one final term that I think is worth spending a little bit of time on, and that's this notion of blended learning, which, according to Christensen Institute, which right now I think is really similar to Bray and McGraw-Hill, has helped to define this term in a way that is becoming more universal amongst educators, where it is a formal education program in which a student learns, at least in part, through online learning, with some element of student control over time, place, path, and/or pace. So you're hearing there's agency, at least in part in a supervised brick-and-mortar location away from home. So that involves some sort of teacher or a facilitator. And the modalities along each student's learning path within a course or subject are connected to provide an integrated learning experience. So this means that as a blended program is developed, it's not developed in isolation for one mode to another, but it's actually developed in such a way that the online portions, the self-driven portions, the teacher portions, the group or collaborative portions actually work together toward the student's end goal. The key models that we speak of in blended learning are station rotation, whole group rotation, flipped classroom, and individual rotation. These are models put forth in a book, Blended Learning in Action, of which I am the co-author. And what we found is in our research and studying various models and implementations of blended learning, what we found was that there was more technology integration than blended learning taking place. And this is the key distinction, because technology integration just means that you purchase laptops, you purchase iPads, you purchase Chromebooks, and you've put them into a classroom. But the actual work of truly ensuring that students take some level of ownership, that there's a coordinated program, that agency is involved, is something that's a little bit more elusive. And so what we did in our book is really thought about some of the key hallmarks of a very sound blended implementation. And those hallmarks include personalization, of course, agency, right, student ownership, audience, where students have a chance to actually demonstrate their learning to an authentic audience that's beyond the teacher. And that might mean their peers, that might mean external experts, that might mean other schools that are partnered with the class or the group that's actually working. We also believe wholeheartedly in connectivity, where students have a chance to do significant amounts of collaboration and connecting with, again, both their peers as well as individuals outside of the school. And also, of course, creativity, where students have a chance to demonstrate their learning by being creative. So it's in these hallmarks, which are illustrated in the book as the pack, that we really begin to unearth what does the true essence of blended learning really mean in a classroom when we begin to go beyond just technology integration. So a couple of examples of this. This is an example from the Charlotte Lab School, where in a Spanish class, students had a chance to leverage connectivity and creativity as they actually built their vocabulary in Spanish. They first researched to find an innovator of their choice. They did that research collectively. They then researched that innovator's life and used the app Satori to build a timeline in Spanish of that person's life over the course of their research. So what that basically meant was this was a blended experience for students that engaged them in a way that connectivity was involved, creativity, and even some levels of student agency. Another good example can be found from Harrisburg South Middle School in South Dakota, where they're currently doing a project that is researching plastic pollution in the ocean. And what the students are doing here is they're working in collaboration, leveraging creativity, connectivity, authentic audience, and agency as they are coming up with solutions for how to solve the plastic pollution problem in the ocean. They're then taking those solutions and using Flipgrid to create videos that are now being shown to experts that are giving the students feedback about their ideas. And in essence, they're incorporating all these different elements, these hallmarks of blended learning, into one single project. So what we're finding more and more is that there's a tremendous amount of opportunities that students and teachers are now leveraging around blended learning that really pushes on, for those of you who are familiar with the SAMR model, that really push on how transformation can happen through redefinition, not just substitution or augmentation. Even with all that being said, there's still a lot of debate around personalized learning. There are some critics, Dan Willingham, that have said that learning itself is cumulative, and students may not always pick the best path of their learning. So if you give students too much agency, they may not actually get to the right endpoint. Dan Meyer, who many of you may know, a renowned math educator, is concerned that personalization may reduce some of the necessary social aspects of learning. So if students are doing too much on their own, are they really getting the benefit that they can get from significant amounts of collaboration or connecting with other learners? And Ben Riley brings up the point that thinking itself is hard, and students may not always choose the more challenging but necessary path. What's further not helped for many one-to-one or personalized learning implementations is that what was supposed to happen was the traditional classroom that we see here on the screen. What we thought was that once technology actually entered this classroom, that we would see the transformational impact. We would see personalization almost happen automatically. We would see students become engaged and come alive in their learning. But what happened in many cases was laptops, computers, et cetera, were put into classrooms. And unfortunately, the same passive and in many cases single modality learning actually continued to take place. And so what we've learned, and now kind of switching into the next portion of my presentation, is that it wasn't enough just to purchase technology. It wasn't enough just to put technology into classrooms. However, there are real opportunities on how technology can be leveraged in schools, in classrooms to achieve real transformation. So the question becomes, where are those opportunities and how can we ensure that as districts are moving towards personalized learning, that they actualize what is truly now possible? So the first thing is ensuring that systems are integrated and simplified enough for ease of use and optimization of learning. The second, rethinking curriculum and school designs to actively work toward personalization. And the third is really making sure that the school becomes a true learning community. As I move towards closing here, I'm going to quickly just talk about, unpack each of these items. The first of which is integration simplification of systems, where what we know is that right now there are a number of systems that impact the learning experience. You have the LMS, content, data tools, apps and tools, devices, productivity suite. And the problem, of course, is that if these systems do not work together, where we ultimately end up landing is teachers that end up being frustrated, tools and content that goes underutilized, learning that's not optimized, and ultimately lost instructional time. And what ends up happening there is that teachers go back to their comfort zone. So the key thing here that we always really implore to school districts and those who are making buying decisions, especially happening early in the chain, is make sure that your systems that you're purchasing are actually able to talk to each other. This is something that's called interoperability that oftentimes doesn't happen in the way that it needs to. The next couple of points I want to make are around the fact that most school models, curriculum included, grading, does not actually support personalized learning. So in essence, teachers are being asked to come off script and come out of their existing structures to actually implement personalized learning. So essentially, that means that they're needing to use adaptive and self-paced supplemental curriculum, and many teachers are beginning to do this. And in some more extreme cases, you have major system overhauls, like, for example, Taylor County in Kentucky, where they've moved to a completely performance-based education where students, no matter what age you're in, you're able to learn at the level at which your current skill requires. So we're seeing more and more personalized learning happening with adaptive technology. Additionally, we're seeing more and more teachers take advantage of innovating as far as schedule and space, rethinking how space is used. Here's a classroom at the Charlotte Lab School where students have flexible seating. You can see there's very few desks. Everything is tables or students sitting on the floors. And what this basically builds is opportunities for students to actually take more agency and creativity as they're defining their learning experience. We're also seeing more and more students actually driving their own schedules. This is another example from Charlotte Lab School where students actually create their plan for the week in collaboration with their teachers. Time and support for teachers is absolutely critical. We'll talk just for a moment about professional learning. And then finally, assessments and progress monitoring, where we're seeing more and more teachers move from your traditional grading and doing more assessments that are happening during class. This is one of my co-authors, Catlin Tucker, who has decided she's going to stop taking grading home. And in effect, she's basically literally been able to move from a feedback loop, which sometimes requires a week or more, to students actually receiving instant feedback in her classroom. Finally, the school as a learning community. What we know is that teachers are individuals just like students are, and we have to begin to think of them as such. So with that being said, final example here is Rio Public Schools that has taken on a fully personalized model where teachers are actually driving their own PD. They're using the Redbird professional development system where teachers have a virtual platform where they can actually move forward at their own pace. It's gamified where they're getting points and badges. They're actually learning in such a way where they're doing collaboration. Actually, in the seat of blended learners, they're getting more creative in their PDs, sending teachers out to conferences, and they're being rewarded as a result of it. And what we're finding is that as teachers are actually given more and more opportunities for collaboration, for creativity, for becoming the blended learners that we know that they can be, in essence, we're putting them in the seat of blended learner. And so the final quote that I want to leave people with as I transition over to Sean Mahoney is, we must allow teachers to become the 21st century learners that we're asking them to help create. And with that, I want to thank you for your time and toss the ball over to Dr. Mahoney. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. I want to say that one of the things I always appreciate about Jason, and I would highly encourage folks to connect with him on Twitter and otherwise, is the way that he anchors the work in the real examples in day-to-day life. In fact, when we were on the phone yesterday, we could hear the classroom ding in the background. So tap into Jason's expertise every chance you get. With that, I'd also like to thank Kurt and district administration. And at the risk of repeating ourselves, I'd like to thank all of you for devoting the time to engage with us this afternoon. I will often repeat that at the beginning of sessions like this. As somebody who's been in the classroom and worked at the district level as a curriculum specialist, I really understand the value of your time, so I thank you very much for engaging with us. And I, too, would invite you to continue the discussion after the webinar proper. My Twitter handle is on screen, and you can see a hashtag that we often use to focus on learning with hashtag purposeful learning. So please reach out during the session or after. I will come back to that quote, and at the risk of sort of quoting Jason back to all of us, bridge to the next portion by picking up on a theme around teaching and the importance of teaching. We will often talk about the moments to empower great teaching, and I deeply believe that great teaching is one of the most important aims of education. We think that the power of a great teacher can really introduce you to yourself and to new notions and to your mind and the world in powerful ways that you may never even thought possible. So it's with that that I began thinking about ways to connect the notion and the power and importance of teaching and meeting the needs of all learners. And I want to start context for the next bit of our discussion by thinking about the relationship of teaching to technology, and want to do so by way of thinking about stories and stories about transformational shifts. So to my mind, you can see one of the transformational stories on screen here. I want to talk to you about caterpillars and butterflies. And what's important when I think about different types of transformation is that in this instance, the butterfly is still an insect. It's simply an insect that flies. And that's one type of transformation. There are all sorts of forms of transformation. People become mothers and fathers, and they begin to think differently about their role in the world. They're now providers, or they're responsible for someone else's life. They have the responsibility to not just care for the child, but to help them achieve their highest understanding of themselves. When I think about other kinds of transformation and start thinking about technology, I often think about the transformations when we went from plays becoming movies. And at first, that new technology, we saw that films were really introduced like plays. They sort of faded up on screen like the curtain, and they faded out with this small circle. And yet the new medium, film, gave us different options for camera techniques and editing techniques. And yet still at its core, it was all about telling a story. So the question in that regard becomes, how do we take advantage of a medium? So similarly in education and in learning science, we're at our core experts in learning and pedagogy. And the medium may be transforming with the introduction of educational technology. We may not be able to touch or feel or sit with the materials in the same way. In fact, we may go from producing textbooks that sit on a shelf for several years to producing data-enabled modular content that really iterates and drives in the moment actionable insights for teachers. And yet, it's not entirely new for us. Overheads were emerging technology at one point. So the digital age, to my mind, is not something for us to fear. In fact, we've been in the transformation in a while, and right now it's about how we optimize it. So to my mind, it's a question of how do we use the medium to help us approach our work differently, and what are the affordances and limitations of technology. We'll focus on this for the rest of our discussion and really focus on meaning and purpose in learning. So with that, there's three things we really want to try and tackle in the second half related to this notion of transformation and helping meet the student needs for every learner. The first thing we want to do is really talk about an approach to research and design in education, including how you optimize personalized learning environments. The second thing we want to do is provide some examples or exemplars of learning research, specifically in this space of personalized learning. And then finally, we want to talk about some principles and frameworks that we utilize to anchor the personalized learning plans, resources that we think help and extend your personalized learning goals. I recognize that we have a variety of different stakeholders with different roles and responsibilities. You wear different hats within your work in education. So I would really kind of challenge and invite folks to think about how this applies and how this translates to your particular context. And I would also plant the seed that there'll be a few moments of interaction with some critical questions as we go throughout, where I'll invite you to use the chat window to have some engagement. So as we move forward, you may have picked up on a theme already. For me and for us, it's all about learning and the learner. And so what you're seeing here is our vision, how we are absolutely committed. This is what gets us up out of the bed in the morning to unlock the full potential of each learner. And importantly, it's really focused on how we do so when those experiences are grounded in research. And when we think about the grounding of research, for us, that's a focus and a deep commitment to how we apply what we understand from theory into action. So this is about how learning happens, how the mind develops. And at McGraw-Hill Education, we're focused on the act and the aspiration of all different dimensions of learning and how this comes to sort of be enacted within the student experience. So how do we take theory from being just theory and balance that against design and the actual student experience? So it's that dance, which is the art of teaching balanced against the science of learning. So when we think about how are we utilizing applied learning sciences, for example, to enhance an instructional experience, that's where we're looking at different dimensions of the student experience. We think it's this magic between the science of learning and the art of teaching where great teaching and learning moments can really flourish. So we see there's a place for researchers, and they play a part. We think students obviously play a critical role. Teachers play a very different and essential role. Parents too. So sort of see this notion as a symphony where we're all playing our parts coming together in this ecosystem to optimize the experience. This is the first place where I want to invite you to engage with us. The first question here is about the nature of learning. And it's with that focus on learning that I'd ask you to enter, one or two words or even a short phrase in the chat window that's in the middle of your screen. And as you're doing that, what we'll start to read back and what you'll see are some of the responses around this intentionally broad question, right? What is the nature of learning? What are some of the key characteristics? What we often hear and see in our discussions with educators, whether it's at the classroom level or the district level or even at the state level, is that there are questions that we're approaching in terms of effectiveness and the student experience that must be validated through a rigorous design and development process. So what you're seeing on screen here is this intentional and careful balance between design and research. And this is the research life cycle that we utilize within our practices at McGraw-Hill Education. And so what's happening at the bottom of the screen are ongoing activities related to applied learning sciences that we're iterating throughout. If you look at the middle section where you see those circles, you kind of move from discovery to implementation. And anyone who's familiar with instructional design can kind of see that as the ADDIE model, right? It's analysis, design, and development. So you're moving from the left-hand side where you think you're trying to solve a problem in the space all the way to the right-hand side where you're implementing at scale and looking for evidence of effectiveness, oftentimes in very rigorous experimental, and I mean that from a research perspective, scenarios. And then above that are all of the different types of methodologies that one might use in order to pair with an object under scrutiny. So what I mean by that is we often have a question in research, we have a design intention, and we believe that research in this iterative research process can allow us to optimize those learning experiences. So it's this life cycle throughout the iteration and design and development and implementation and back around again that really allows us to think about these personalized ecosystems in ways that allow us to meet the needs of all learners. When we think about how that research life cycle intersects with the dimensions of learning science, it's really about continuous improvement in ecosystems. So what you're seeing on screen here are different aspects of how we think about learning science within the context of that research continuum. So absolutely, it's about research and the study of key questions related to how learning is happening. So questions related to cognitive load or how much information is on a particular page or screen and how it's chunked in relationship to the student experience. There's absolutely questions related to the development methods. So how are we approaching this particular pedagogy, and how is that manifesting itself with the tools of technology to help individual learners? What can we learn by way of feedback mechanisms, for example? There's also the way that we build the tools based on learning science. So this is about evidence-based design and deeply embedding iterative work with teachers and students in classroom scenarios and even mock classroom scenarios where we're doing lightweight testing with these materials. And then finally, the learning science work and the research life cycle is deeply rooted in data analytics. This is a place where we believe that, number one, we have to respect the data, these records of experience, including the privacy and security that comes with that. That's important to note here. That we are looking at small data. Oftentimes you'll hear folks talking about big data. For us, this is about the data related to teaching and learning moments that allow individual teachers and students to look at actionable insights about progress towards a learning objective that in the moment allow us to move forward and think about what's the next right thing for that student. So it's with that in mind that we often say we enter each new phase of life as a novice. And what this means for us is that there's really an ongoing cycle in design and research for educational purposes, and particularly with educational technology, where we ask questions, we seek new understanding, and we apply what we learn. So we're constantly moving through this phase of novice to master, where we question, test, and apply. And it's this research process that allows us to develop a personalized learning plan and allows us, as well as our partners, to ask questions like, what evidence of data are we going to utilize to assess if we're meeting every student's needs? What are our key performance indicators within our ecosystem? And you can define that ecosystem in many ways. How will we know, for example, when we are seeing success? How are we defining that hypothesis early on? What outcomes are we actually seeking? And how will we, this is really important, revise and refine our plan and our understanding as we learn more about how these tools are utilized in the moment? So I want to come back to another essential question. And this one is now taking us from sort of the 35,000-foot level of what's the nature of learning to attributes of personalized learning. And you heard about several different attributes and dimensions in Jason's portion of the discussion. This second question, again, I invite you to use one or two words or a short phrase in that middle chat window. And in the next 30 seconds, you'll start to see some of the responses come in from your colleagues here. When we think about the attributes of personalized learning and how those play out, I'd like to discuss this by way of some exemplars. So what you're seeing on screen here is an example of how, to my mind, not all tools, particularly in educational technology and educationally technology-driven ecosystems, are created equal. This is an example, and I promise I will unpack this for you. This is an example of the intelligence sitting behind our solution, Alex. And this particular example, at the very top of the screen in the middle, you see a light blue stroke around an equation. And if you kind of draw a line right down the middle, there's a green box at the very bottom in the middle. So at the top, you have the equation, and at the bottom, you have the solution. And in between, what you're seeing are all of the ways that students went from the question to arriving at a correct solution. And what you're seeing in the middle are the most frequently utilized methods, and what you're seeing on the edges are the fringes, all of the ways that students creatively, maybe unorthodox ways, went about solving that problem. So this is an example where utilizing the capabilities of technology really comes into play. Number one, we have to be humble about the notion of creativity and of how students are actually going to approach problem solving in novel ways and be prepared to capture those creative cases. Second, we have to think about how we're utilizing the technology to inform and optimize the personalized learning path, right? So based on their progression, based on how I may move through this particular problem and solution set, I'm going to receive an individualized path that might be very different than what Jason, for example, experiences based on his capabilities and competencies. So this is an example where we have to work differently, where we're taking advantage of the medium in an appropriate way to support and empower great teaching. This is truly an example. I see someone mentioned about meeting students at the level they are and in ways to continue to help them grow in their knowledge. This is one example of how those paths are very personalized. Another example, and you're seeing on screen here, is an exemplar of Redbird Mathematics, where we have a research-based approach to designing and really preparing educators for the 21st century. So it comes back to that notion of really empowering great teaching. What you're seeing here within these circles are examples of, as the header states, ways to utilize adaptive technology that help address personalized learning. So in the first circle, you're seeing this notion of patterns of response. So it's utilizing the patterns of response for one individual student to automatically remediate or accelerate and offer a personalized learning path based on those individual patterns of responses. Secondly, it's leveraging engaging multimedia in ways that enhance and augment the learning experience. So oftentimes this is what is called germane cognitive load. It's media that you add to the learning experience that actually enhances understanding. So for example, if someone has never experienced the concept of osmosis and you show an animation of osmosis, that oftentimes will be germane and enhance their understanding. The third circle there is getting at this notion of multiple modes of instruction, and this is really another way of thinking about differentiation of support for individual learners within the system. And then the last circle is getting at this idea of actionable insights and information for students and teachers. So in real time, how am I progressing and how am I able to monitor my own learning? So a third example of ways that you can leverage technology to personalize students' experiences and really meet them where they are is through experience, right? Experiential learning. So what you're seeing on screen here is actually a screenshot that I took from a LearnSmart lab. And what's happening in this particular instance is the students are actually engaging in a really realistic, like a highly realistic simulated lab experience. And what it allows them to do is make mistakes in the execution of the scientific method. So they get to muck about after they've mastered some basic concepts and skills. So they actually get to compare the water concentrations in different solutions, and they get to apply selectively permeable membranes to the broad end of each tube. So there's all of these different actions and variables that the students get to interact with as they carry out the experiment. And it's another example of how you get to leverage technology, allow the student some choice and voice within a contained activity in order to help scaffold them towards greater understanding of some of the basic concepts. So they're learning through doing and learning through reflection on doing. The fourth example that we'll walk through here is actually a really interesting simulation called Fossil Dig. And this is actually developed in partnership with Concord Consortium. And this is from our Inspire Science solution. And one of the reasons why I think this is an excellent example of the ways that technology can help personalize the experience for students and bring together the interdisciplinary threads of their work is because it allows for flexibility, number one, in the different types of layers that students investigate. So this is an instance where we're taking real-world problem solving, we're taking different issues related to hands-on inquiry, data analysis, and critical thinking skills. So you're bringing together a bit of language arts, a bit of science, a bit of math, and allowing the students, in this case, to actually go into a virtual space, which in most cases could not be done in a physical classroom, right? They're going into an archaeological virtual dig, and they can change the variables that give them different outcomes. So this is one way that the students can play with those variable outcomes, and in the upper right-hand corner, what you're seeing is that the students provide responses to these kind of quick check questions, And then in red, what you're seeing is some of the immediate feedback. So again, the students get to muck about, experiment, and this is a case where students who maybe need more time and opportunity to investigate, or maybe need to see the interrelationship between different variables or cause and effect reactions, are able to do so in a way that allows them, again, to integrate these skills of measurement and reasoning abstractly and asking and answering questions in a very interdisciplinary way that allows not the students to only see their progression over time, but the teachers as well. So this is a place where we think about technology as a tool, but a tool that has to be fit for purpose. So it's not just about the right tool, but it's the right tool at the right time for the right student for the right reason. So when we think about personalized learning plans, including the tools that you employ to help you realize those and meet students where they are and take them where they need to go, they are most often effective in our experience when they are purposeful. So you heard Jason earlier allude to the notion of device selection. This is a place where time and time again we see schools that focus on learning be successful. So don't lead with the devices, lead with the learning. It's about purposeful learning. What are your learning objectives? What is your instructional model? And from there, selecting the right tools to help you meet those needs. So I want to go to the last question here, which is, what frameworks and principles can support and extend your personalized learning strategy? So in other words, what frameworks and principles are you relying on to help you meet the needs of all students? So this is a place where, again, I would invite you to maybe even drop one or two references into the chat window in the middle of your screen and share with your colleagues some of the principles and frameworks you're utilizing that you've felt particularly helpful in meeting the needs of all students. As you're doing so, I will share a couple of examples that we've used by way of principles and frameworks that we find very important and help augment and extend personalized learning plans. What you're seeing on screen here are guiding principles for English learners. So this is one example. It's a little bit hot off the presses, actually, of some work that we did with leading educators in English language acquisition and English language development. And what we did was scan the research and conduct deep literature reviews and pair that with practice, and have codified and described 9 essential principles for supporting English language learners. So it's everything from cultivating meaning to teaching structure and form to developing language and context. And for each of these principles, we give some principles in action. What does this look like and sound like in the classroom? And then extend it to research should you want to explore it more. So those principles are one example of how we think about kind of bringing structure and scale to meeting the needs of all learners and giving you a common vocabulary for how you're approaching that. The example you're seeing on screen right now is a principled approach to ecosystems overall. And it's an example of the framework that we utilize when we're thinking about designing and developing ecosystems. And again, taking advantage of the medium. So what's happening in that yellow circle up top is this idea of designed curriculum, in the orange, taught curriculum, so as it's enacted in real life, in realia, and formative assessment. And it's those 3 that interact to create this virtual cycle in the classroom. And what's happening below are all of the different actors or agents in the system. So in our case, we have instructional designers, for example, and academic designers who are really thinking deeply about how we might tag the content, for instance, with things like Bloom's level or Lexile level, so that we can describe the nature of the content that the student is interacting with, so that the next actor, the teacher, for example, can both receive information about how the student is interacting with that content, but also be empowered to do things like add flexible content. So if you have a piece of open educational resources, for instance, that you want to add and augment to the lesson, we are treating that like first-class content within our system and allowing you to do so. So you get to set the garden walls. This is getting back to that notion of flexibility, structure with flexibility. And finally, on the right-hand side, there's the agent of the learner and how their personalized learning path and how the objective-based interactions are actually driving those individualized paths. So this is excellent place to think about your ecosystems and these different actors and elements and how you describe the approach to that ecosystem with all of your stakeholders. So one of the questions that we often ask ourselves is, who can't wait to help us? And the reason we ask this is because we found that in this work, partnerships are critically important to success. And so which partners are really there to help you succeed, and what are their attributes? What we've seen time and time again in this work is that partners who are willing to ask you smart questions, ask probing questions, dig deeply on the why behind the what, and really understand what you're trying to achieve is one of the key ways to make this work and work at scale. So when we think about kind of bringing things full circle, and we started with that transformation story and discussed how we're thinking about how to take advantage of the medium, but at its core, we are absolutely committed to academically and educationally sound content. At its core, we are all learners. We are all teachers who are thinking about lifelong learning and really trying to understand how, yes, we take advantage of the medium of technology, but we do so with the lens of purposeful learning at its core. So with that, I want to be mindful of our time. I'm going to pause here and turn it back to Kurt so that we can take some questions and have an exchange with folks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sean and Jason. Yes, we'll get to the Q&A portion here. First, a couple reminders, as we often get comments and questions asking about accessing the slides and the archive recording. And yes, everyone will be getting a follow-up email with links to those, so you'll be able to access those. So don't worry about that. And another reminder here, if you do have a question, just enter it in the Q&A box, not the chat window, but the Q&A at the bottom right-hand corner, if you would. That puts it into a queue for us, makes it a lot easier, and we'll get to as many as we can here. Let's see, first question I might go to Jason with first. It says, how do we address the modular nature of different parties currently writing bits and pieces of digital curriculum that can ultimately be incoherent to students? Many schools attempting to personalize through playlist models, for example, face this dilemma. Jason, what do you think about that? Does that get at sort of the, you mentioned the importance of interoperability between some of these systems? Yeah, go ahead.
Yep. So this is actually a really, really good question, and something that I've seen honestly go haywire when playlist models are attempted or very modular digital content is used without the either teacher or a system within the school really set up to make sure that those things are actually cohesive. Let me be more specific. So at the far end, maybe a teacher is just pulling a one lesson from Khan Academy to address a certain group of students that might be struggling with fraction. If you play that out, it becomes very difficult for a teacher to attempt to put together small bits of content without putting a lot of time into making sure that those things actually align. My recommendation is, for many teachers, the time and proficiency in using these kind of small bites and modular digital content, most teachers are not there yet. So my recommendation is actually that as a first step, as an intermediary step toward the playlist model, toward teachers being, once they get more fluent in how they put together digital content, is to actually identify tools that are not as modular, like, for example, some of the tools that Dr. Mahoney actually referenced, where a teacher can have a student using digital curriculum that allows for some level of adaptivity, some level of personalization based on an algorithm that's already built into that tool. That, to me, is the best first step towards addressing the modular challenge of digital curriculum, especially as districts are trying to get teachers to become more comfortable with the station rotation model with even individual playlist models by allowing them to take some of the training wheels off without necessarily putting an entirely new work stream on them and having to coordinate a bunch of smaller chunks of content.
Yeah, so Jason, I would just love to underscore the point you made around cohesiveness and time. I think some key concepts are cohesion and coherence, and the idea of priority and optimization, not maximization. So in other words, this notion of structure with flexibility is really important. And I often think of a conversation that I had with a district who was at a Future Ready School Summit, and it was on this very topic, and they were recounting how they had the intent of building out a district-created core curriculum for one of their language arts programs. And the superintendent was talking about how he brought together the teachers who had both volunteered and who were recommended by their peers to, over the summer break, essentially design the first 3 units of this core curriculum that would get them through the first semester. And what he said was they very quickly realized that the depth and time commitment to do so, even dealing with pieces at a much larger scale than some of the bits and bytes in the playlist that we're talking about, was infeasible. And they actually, over the course of the entire summer, made it through 3 lessons. So this idea of where's your time investment, I think, is a really important one. The idea of cobbling and kind of curating even the best-in-class open educational resources is really time-intensive. So, it's free like a puppy, not free like a beer. It comes with work. And so I think acknowledging that time investment and really focusing on cohesion and coherence is important. And like Jason, we've seen examples where when schools or districts say, you know what, we're going to pick one element of the instructional model where we really want to focus our teacher time. So for example, we may pick one element of the end of unit experience or the introduction to a particular topic, and we're going to focus on project-based learning. And that's going to be the moment that we carefully craft and where we invest our time. So starting small and being very intentional about the cohesiveness, I think, is key.
Okay, sure. Thank you both very much. Let's see. Next, got a couple of related questions here. One person asks about accessibility. What about everything being accessible for all students, including, for example, math materials for students who are blind? Certainly disability there. There's another question here asking about special needs students in a mixed classroom. Can they benefit from tools like this? Jason, might go to you first.
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts there or maybe advice?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. I actually am a big believer in, I'll address kind of the special needs question and within that, the other question that you put together there. I'm actually a big believer, and I've seen this happen as I talked about in some of the higher performing, if you will, blended environments where because a teacher is able to better leverage the technology tools at their disposal, and that might mean, I'll keep it very simple, an adaptive math curriculum in, let's say, a station rotation model where you're able to actually create a multimodal classroom, and also a classroom where at the heart of blended learning is students actually getting instruction that they need at the right time, as Sean spoke about. So let's actually unpack this, because when you start thinking about this in terms of students that have special learning needs, the opportunities that teachers now possess to be more differentiating, more individualizing, and ideally more personalizing actually goes up tremendously. So ultimately, if you really think about this, every student has some sort of special learning need because that student is at a certain level, at a certain point, learns a certain way that other students don't. And so in essence, by leveraging technology in a way that makes sense and teachers can be comfortable with and actually kind of set their classrooms up in a way that students get their more personalized experience, that also holds true for students with learning needs. So to carry out that example that I started with around the math class, let's take a teacher that has 20 students. Let's say 5 of them do have some sort of IEP. What if that teacher was able to utilize a math program, whether it's an intervention program, even an acceleration program, whether it be Redbird Math, iReady, ST Math, there's a number of them that are very strong. Let's say that teacher was able to leverage technology in a way that there was a group of students that was working on a more kind of a personalized path using digital technology, while another group of students was working with that teacher in an intervention style where the teacher is able to work more one-on-one or more small group. Essentially, what you're doing is you're allowing that teacher to have a much greater impact on addressing specific learning needs, especially when that teacher is able to choose and be savvy enough to select the right tools. And there's a number of tools that are out there now to address intervention, remediation, even for that matter, students that have, you mentioned blind, students that are deaf, there are auditory substitutes. And so all this goes back to the teacher being comfortable enough with their technology and able to design the classroom in a way that various students can actually get various experiences simultaneously. And that truly is the essence of what blended learning really should be about.
Yeah, I would build on Jason's response and maybe take it to the 35,000-foot level and think about scale and the ecosystem. And so, my teams are responsible for developing solutions that are accessible. And so I think about standards and guidelines, things like WCAG 2.0 and assistive technologies. And literally was just in a discussion and a design session yesterday, we were talking about device testing at scale and how to optimize screen reader technology to support those learners. So I think one of the things that our industry is becoming increasingly educated about is standards and guidelines that help set a baseline set of expectations so that all learners are not able to access the content only, but really engage with it in a meaningful way, regardless of circumstances. So I would just come back to this notion of standards and guidelines and really asking questions about the personalized learning solutions and their capabilities in that regard, so that you have a high level of confidence that the technology is going to meet your minimum standards and guidelines, particularly for specialized populations.
Okay, great. Makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much. Well, it does look like we've hit all our questions here. We're just about at the top of the hour here. So I'm going to wrap things up on behalf of District Administration. Of course, I'd like to thank our speakers for today, Jason and Sean. Thank you both so much for being with us today and sharing your time and expertise with us. And thank you to our sponsor, once again, McGraw-Hill Education, for their generous support of our seminar here. And once again, to everyone in our audience, thank you so much for joining us. I do hope you found our seminar informative and useful to you. Producing events like this is just part of our mission at DA, to inform school district leaders like you about the latest news and trends in K-12 management. You'll find more coverage about issues such as the ones we discussed here in the pages of our monthly print magazine, as well as on our website and in our free daily e-newsletter, DA Daily. And as I mentioned before, for those of you who would like to share this event with your colleagues, or if you want to go over the speaker's presentation at your own pace, you can access it from our website by going to the URL on your screen here, districtadministration.com/webseminars, where it will be posted in the archive section within about 48 hours. And if you'd like to download the slides, you'll find instructions and a link in a thank you email that you'll receive later on today. So keep an eye out for that, and you'll have the opportunity to go back over this and share with anyone on your team at your district. So that is it for today's event. Once again, I'm Kurt Isley-Durley for District Administration. On behalf of our producer, Jason York, and everyone on my production team, goodbye, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much for joining us.